I don't usually eat at funerals, but tonight I'm paid to. You crouch beside the body, mud on your knees, stale bread in your hand. The family watches from the edge of the field, not out of respect. They're afraid of you. On the dead man's chest lies a coin, and another lump of bread. You pick it up, break it in half, and eat. That's it. That's your job. You eat the sins. Before doctors, before disinfectant, before priests agreed who could get into heaven, there was you, the sin eater, a man paid to take on the spiritual garbage of someone else's life, because sins were sticky and nobody wanted them lying around, so they hired someone to absorb them, one bite at a time. It didn't make you holy, didn't make you safe, it made you dangerous. You carried the weight of the dead, but no one would carry you, so you did the job alone. Tonight, we'll join you, in the mud, in the quiet. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, so you don't miss the next ritual. Welcome to Yawnamentary. This is the story of history's hungriest outcast. Let's say you die. People don't know where your soul is. You were kind, but you also stole some bread. You lied once, maybe twice. Nothing dramatic, but still enough to stain a soul. And if that soul doesn't get cleaned, it sticks around. So someone has to eat the stains. Enter the sin eater, a living person who absorbs your sins through food. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, literally. Bread placed on your chest, ale poured beside your head. They eat, they drink, they mutter a few words, and just like that your guilt is transferred out of you, into them, like wringing out a wet cloth, if that cloth were a corpse. Sin-eating was never part of official religion. Not canon, not doctrine, but it survived for centuries on the edges of both. Too useful to ban, too creepy to bless. It lived in the cracks, between fear and tradition, between ritual and rot. The church didn't invent sin-eating, but it didn't stop it either. It likely began as folklore, a blend of pagan burial rites, Christian fears, and peasant pragmatism. Because people didn't like uncertainty, so they created a system, one that didn't require forgiveness, just calories. The sin-eater wasn't a priest, he wasn't trained, he didn't need Latin, all he needed was bread, beer, and a willingness to be avoided in public. Some scholars trace it to scapegoat rituals, ancient practices where one creature was burdened with the guilt of others, then banished. Same logic, different livestock. In sin-eating, the bread became the body of your wrongdoing, and the eater became the exile. He walked away carrying it all, while you stayed behind, clean and buried. The church never blessed it, but they didn't fight it hard either, because it worked. Not spiritually, not theologically, but socially. People slept better knowing the sins were gone, even if they just moved to someone else's stomach. You're in rural Wales, sometime between 1600 and 1800. No one kept very precise records when it came to men like you. Your cottage sits at the far edge of a village that barely wants to admit you exist. The thatch leaks. The hearth smokes. The dog that follows you is skinnier than you are. Most days pass in silence. But when someone dies, and someone always dies, they send a boy to find you. Not the priest, not the doctor, you, because you're the sin-eater. You don't carry a title. You don't wear robes. No one ever taught you Latin. What you bring is bread, ale, and a willingness to stand near the dead. You walk in with your hands full and your head low. The door is left open just enough. The family doesn't greet you. They don't want to. The body is already laid out, sometimes on a bed, other times on a wooden board near the hearth. A crust of bread rests on the chest. A bowl of beer sits at the feet. You kneel or crouch, or simply hover for a moment, then get to work. You eat. You drink. You say very little, maybe nothing at all. They believe the bread soaks up the dead person's sins, and by swallowing it you carry those sins away, out of the house, out of the village, away from those who mourn but don't want the burden. No one thanks you. You're paid, if at all, in pennies or leftovers. Sometimes they forget to leave anything, but they never forget to look away. You don't sit at the tavern. You don't attend the weddings. Children are told not to touch you. The villagers pretend not to see you on market day until the next death comes. Then you are remembered very clearly. They whisper that you're full of evil. That sin builds up inside you like soot in a chimney. That one day it'll come bursting out. Others claim you don't age, or that you die young. The truth is less interesting. You're just tired. You walk home in the dark with no torch, no road, no company, just the ache in your gut, and the knowledge that once again they call you instead of the priest. Because the priest offers hope, but you offer cleanup. You deal in leftovers. You deal in the sins too petty to confess and too sticky to ignore. When you sit down by your fire, the dog at your feet and the bread still rough on your tongue, you wonder how much of other people's guilt you can carry before it becomes your own. There's no answer, just another knock on the door next week, and another body, and another bite. The ritual wasn't elaborate, but it was specific. It had to be. People feared what happened if you got it wrong. Not for you. No one cared about you, but for the dead. Because a poorly eaten sin might linger. It might crawl back into the coffin, or worse, out of it. You arrived alone. No ceremony. No procession. Just a nod from a grieving relative and a gesture toward the room. The body was always waiting, sometimes fresh, sometimes not. They didn't embalm, and they didn't wait long. If the death came at night, they called you by morning. If it happened in the morning, you'd be eating by dusk. The body was often wrapped in linen, or just covered with a sheet. The bread sat on the chest, sometimes under the chin, if the arms were crossed. The ale, when they could afford it, sat nearby in a chipped cup. You never asked why. You sat, or crouched, or stood with your head bent low. The bread was dry, usually from the heels of a loaf no one wanted. You chewed in silence. You didn't speak unless you had to. A few whispered words, a phrase passed down from someone older, maybe Latin, maybe just local nonsense. Some sin-eaters used the same line every time. I take unto myself the sins of this soul, that it may rest in peace. Others said nothing. The eating was enough. Some families crossed themselves, Others watched with open disgust. A few left the room altogether, unable to look. You never judged. You didn't have the energy. You just focused on chewing, swallowing, finishing what they left for you. When you were done, you stood, wiped your hands. If there was anything to wipe them on, left in silence. Payment was sometimes in a small cloth bag by the door, sometimes not. Once, a child handed you a penny. Once, someone spat at your feet. Once you finished the ritual and found your shoes missing. You never went back to that house. The thing is, people thought of sin like mud. It clung to the soul. It stained everything. And you were the rag, the sponge, the sacrificial stomach. You absorbed what they couldn't carry, and they hated you for making it look so easy. They never asked how many sins you'd eaten. They didn't want to know, because if they did, they'd have to ask the next question. How much can one man carry? You weren't part of the community. Not really. You lived near it, around it, just outside its circle, close enough to be found, far enough to be forgotten. And even if someone did want to talk to you, what would they say? Thanks for eating my uncle's spiritual baggage. No, it didn't work like that. You weren't a priest. You weren't a butcher. You were something worse than both. A reminder of guilt, of death, of what people didn't want to carry themselves. They told their children not to touch you, not because you were dangerous, but because you were porous. You had absorbed too much. It might rub off. Even the dogs didn't follow you, except your own, and you didn't name him. Naming made things harder to lose. Over time, the stares stopped, not because they accepted you, but because they learned to pretend you weren't there. In the market, they stepped around you. In the churchyard, they looked through you. In the tavern, you sat in the corner until someone asked you to leave. Sometimes they didn't bother asking. They just made sure your stool was missing. You never complained. Complaints were for people who mattered. You were just part of the death process, like the shroud or the spade. They didn't thank the coffin. Why would they thank you? Still, they feared you, not in the way they feared curses or plagues, in a quieter way. You were the ghost that kept breathing, the funeral that walked home. The sin eater didn't wear a mask. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew what he was. There were stories. There are always stories that you could smell guilt, that your shadow pointed toward the next person to die, that you aged backwards or not at all, that you dreamed other people's dreams, that if you kissed someone, they'd carry your weight for a day and never recover. No one could prove any of it, but no one wanted to be the test case either. So they watched from doorways, from windows, from the edge of the field. You didn't speak to crowds. You didn't try to explain. You weren't misunderstood. You were understood far too well. You were what people made of you, and that made you unbearable. Still, someone always knocked, and you always answered, because if you didn't, who would? Most of the records come from Wales and the Welsh borderlands, where sin-eating was quietly accepted, not celebrated, not encouraged, but tolerated. The English found it distasteful, the church found it heretical, but in remote hill villages, where priests were rare and purgatory was terrifying. People did what worked. If that meant giving stale bread to a man who lived in a hut, so be it. The ritual varied. In some parts of the country, it was just bread and ale. In others, the sin-eater would pass his hands over the corpse 3 times. Some spat after the ritual, as if trying to rid themselves of whatever had touched them. Some burned the cup used for ale, others kept it and never drank from it again. Sin didn't just travel in the mouth, it clung to objects they believed and had to be treated like a contagion. There were hints of similar practices elsewhere. In Bavaria, funeral feasts included special loaves meant only for mourning. In parts of France, bread was baked with coins inside, then broken over the grave. In the Balkans, certain families paid mourners to wail and eat at the same time, a mix of grief, noise, and symbolic cleansing. No one called them sin-eaters, but the idea was familiar. Someone eats so the dead don't have to. Even in colonial America, echoes appeared. In the Appalachian Mountains, some communities baked small loaves to be placed on the chest of the dead. No one was paid to eat them, but someone always did, quietly, without being asked. The names changed, the rituals shifted, but the fear stayed the same. A soul must be emptied before burial, or it might come back full. There were no biographies, no gravestones with titles, no written contracts, but a few names survived, passed down in whispers, or scratched into parish records by someone with second thought. One of them was Richard Munslow. He lived in Shropshire and died in 1906. That's not a typo, 1906. While the world was inventing airplanes and phonographs, a man in England was still being paid to eat sins. They said Munslow was a prosperous farmer, not the usual type. Most sin-eaters were poor, desperate, socially exiled, but Munslow was respected, educated. He wore real clothes. Some say he took up the role after losing several children to illness, that it was grief, not poverty, that drove him to it, that eating sins was his way of controlling what he couldn't explain, or at least giving the deaths a purpose. There's no proof of what he believed, only that he did it, multiple times, for a fee, sometimes as a favour, sometimes in silence. Local accounts describe the bread, the graveside muttering, the way people stood back when he passed. Munslow was buried in the same churchyard where he worked. His headstone is modest. No mention of what he did, just a name, a date, and the ground beneath it. Maybe someone placed bread on his chest too. Maybe not. No one talks about who eats the sin-eater's sins. Outside of him, the trail fades. No known successors, no apprentices, just the usual suspects. Anonymous figures from rural obituaries, folklore fragments, odd receipts in vicar ledgers. The sin-eaters left no legacy because their job was to disappear. Once the bread was eaten, you weren't supposed to speak of it. And so, mostly they didn't. The church never officially sanctioned sin-eating. It was too superstitious, too theatrical, too hard to control. But in many parishes, they didn't stop it either. Sin eaters operated in a theological grey zone, neither blessed nor condemned, not part of the service, but not dragged out of it either. A tolerated heresy, quiet, local, and convenient. In poor rural areas, a priest might only visit once a season. If someone died between visits, families had choices: bury the body themselves, wait for the next sermon, or find the man who ate sins. Option 3 was quicker, and honestly more satisfying. Bread on the chest felt like action. The muttered words, whether sacred or nonsense, felt like a ritual. It was something, a gesture, a release. No paperwork, no incense, just a man doing a job. Clergy knew it happened. Some looked the other way. Some issued vague warnings from the pulpit about unsanctioned practices, but few ever confronted it directly, because they understood what it was. Sin eating was about fear of damnation, of unfinished business, of the soul lingering too long in limbo. It was easier to let the villagers have their ritual than try to replace it. Some whispered that even priests made use of it, that in their final hours, some clergy, especially the old or guilty, requested a sin-eater out of earshot, just in case, not officially of course, but off the record, one bite, one drink, one muttered phrase, as backup. It didn't matter whether it worked. It only mattered that it felt like it might. And in the face of death, sometimes a maybe was enough. Bread meant something. It always had. Body of Christ, daily provision, final meal. It was food, but it was also a symbol, and in sin eating it became both. The bread laid on the corpse wasn't consecrated, but it was treated like it could absorb something, not holiness, not grace, something heavier, something sticky. They believed sin had mass. It had to go somewhere. If the priest didn't absolve it, if the dying didn't confess it, it stayed behind, hovered, clung. The bread was a trap, a sponge. It soaked in what words couldn't reach. And when you ate it, you didn't just consume grain, you consumed guilt. That's why it couldn't be sweet, it couldn't be fresh. It had to be dry, hard, bitter, easier to believe the sins were real if the chewing hurt a little. The ale, too, served a purpose. It wasn't celebratory, it wasn't refreshing, it was washing. You drank to seal the act, to carry it down, to make sure it stayed. Some believed the ritual worked instantly, that the moment you swallowed, the soul was clean. Others said it took longer, that sin took time to digest, that it worked its way into you like rot in wood, slow creeping, irreversible. Maybe that's why sin-eaters rarely lived long, or if they did, they lived wrong, alone, sickly, half-shadowed. Objects used in the ritual were often destroyed: the bowl, the cloth, even the plank the body lay on. People didn't want souvenirs, they wanted distance. And even when it was over, they opened windows, lit candles, whispered prayers they hadn't used in years, just to be sure. It wasn't superstition, not to them. It was insurance, cheap, rural, and quietly terrifying. It didn't pay well. That's the first thing to know. If people had silver, they spent it on the coffin, or the beer, or the priest, if they could get one. The sin eater came last, if at all. Payment ranged from a few pennies to a chunk of bread and a look that said, "You'll eat it anyway." Sometimes it wasn't even offered, just assumed. You'd show up, do the job, and leave. A crust by the door might be all you got. Other times you'd find nothing, just an open door and a full plate on a corpse. That was the deal. It wasn't a job for the ambitious. It was a job for the necessary. And if you wanted respect, you looked elsewhere, because while people feared you, they also thought you were cheap. Holy men wore vestments. You wore your own shoes until they fell apart. But still people came, because guilt is a kind of debt, and most people die in it. If a man cursed once, drank too much, stole a chicken, cheated at dice, whatever the scale, those sins had weight, and for a coin they could be eaten, not forgiven, just moved, relocated. Even nobles used them quietly, through servants, through whispers. They'd never admit it, but bread was bread, and fear didn't care about rank when faced with eternity. Even the wealthy reached for someone to carry the leftover weight. The economics of it was simple. One sin eater meant a cleaner conscience for everyone else. It was efficient, silent, scalable. You didn't need churches or councils, just one man with a strong stomach and no one to sit beside at dinner. And you took it, because someone had to, because the job was awful, and because no one else would. You're older now, slower, the jobs come less often, fewer people believe in the ritual, fewer still are willing to admit it matters, but occasionally someone still knocks. A widow, a brother, a family that keeps old habits, the way others keep heirlooms, quietly and just in case. You walk the same road. The bread is just as dry. The words are still yours. And when you eat, you do it slowly, not because of age, but because you understand now what you're really carrying. Not sin, not exactly, it's regret, grief, a little shame, mostly silence. They don't make eye contact. They never did, but now it feels different, like they're grateful in a way they don't know how to express. Not because they believe the ritual works, but because they don't want to leave anything undone. You eat, you drink, you bow your head, and when you leave, it's quieter than before, not because they've forgotten you, but because for a while they don't need you. One day, you don't wake up, and no one comes. There is no knock, no bread, no final plate. But someone notices, the dog barking, the chimney gone cold. Eventually, someone steps inside. And maybe, just maybe, they lay a crust on your chest. They don't say the words. They don't know them. They mean them. And somewhere, in a village with no name, the last sin eater is finally full. And finally done. No one ever talked about what happened when a sin eater died. They just let it happen, quietly, quickly. No bread, no ale, no one muttering by the bed. because no one wanted to take on what he carried. It was one thing to absorb a neighbour's petty sins, a stolen coin, a cruel word, a broken promise. It was another to eat the sins of the man who'd eaten 100 others. That wasn't a ritual, that was suicide. Some believed the weight stayed in his body, that it clung to the bones, that if you dug him up a year later, the ground would still reek of guilt. Others said it leaked out of death, that the air around his grave felt wrong, that the soil grew nothing, that animals avoided it. No one ever visited, not out of cruelty, out of superstition. Most sin-eaters were buried on the outskirts, not in the churchyard, not near the family plot, just somewhere they could be forgotten. A few were burned, a few left unmarked. No one wanted to inherit the role. No one wanted to become the next vessel. There was no ceremony, no thank you, just the sound of dirt hitting the lid and a prayer no one meant. They never wrote it down, but they all had a theory. The villagers, the mourners, the children who peeked through shutters. Each one carried an idea of what exactly you were swallowing. Some thought it was the soul itself. That part of the dead went with you, latched onto your ribs, nested behind your eyes. Others believed it was something more abstract. Regret, malice, the sludge that collects when a person doesn't live right, but never says sorry. You didn't argue. You didn't confirm. You just kept chewing. And in their silence, they filled the gaps with stories. That your breath could turn milk sour. That your hands could smudge mirrors. That your shadow never quite matched your shape. You became the container for every fear they didn't want to explain. Easier to blame the eater than admit they believed in something dark. In some villages they needed you. Not liked, not welcomed, but needed. You were the one they called when the priest was too far and the guilt was too close. And though they never said it out loud, there was relief in your presence. You made the death feel finished. They didn't invite you to weddings, didn't make eye contact in the square, but when someone died, especially suddenly, they sent for you before the body went cold. You were part of the process, like closing the eyes, like washing the feet, a necessary wrong to keep things right. Some places even kept bread aside, just in case. A certain kind, dry, set on a shelf, nobody touched. They didn't talk about it, but it was there, waiting for you. And when you came, you didn't knock, you didn't sit, you didn't stay. You did what they couldn't, ate what they feared, and left. No one said goodbye. You hear Sin Eater, and you picture a man, ragged beard, hollow eyes, bread in hand. But not all of them were men. In smaller, poorer communities, the job fell to whoever was available and willing. Sometimes that meant a woman. No official records, no names carved into stone, but oral histories speak of widows, of midwives, of women who already sat close to death in daily life. They weren't seen as sacred, just convenient. A neighbour who didn't flinch at the sight of a body, a grandmother who knew the old words. People didn't talk about them much. It was harder to look away from a woman doing something unnatural. Eating sins wasn't just grim, it was unfeminine, which made it all the more effective. Fear, after all, Sticks better when it feels wrong. She'd come after dark, covered in shawls. Avoid the main road. The bread might be left on the doorstep, the payment folded in cloth. The whole exchange silent, efficient, almost like a crime. And in the morning, the village would pretend it hadn't happened. Sin-eating wasn't the only task reserved for the untouchable. Every village had roles that came with a cost. The grave digger, the hangman, the leper watcher, people who lived close to death and were paid in coin, fear and distance. Like the executioner, often masked, always avoided. He dealt out justice, but couldn't sit at the table, or the plague cart driver, whose home was never visited, whose children didn't marry. These weren't evil people, just useful ones, tolerated because they took on what no one else would. The sin-eater fit right in, same category, different meal. You weren't punished, but you were marked, necessary, but never clean. You could save a soul and still be barred from the tavern. That's the pattern. The more death you touch, the less human you become, to them anyway. You weren't part of the world. You were the cost of keeping it tidy. Over time, you learned not to look too closely at the faces, at the families, at the rooms that smelled like sickness and regret. You tried not to notice the toys in the corner, the half-finished meals, the quiet crying behind the door. Because if you cared, it got harder. If you let it in, the grief, the fear, the what-ifs, you'd never get through the bread. Your hands would shake, your voice would crack, and the whole point was to be steady, to be the part of death that didn't flinch. So you trained yourself to chew without tasting, to mutter without feeling, to leave without looking back. But some days it caught up with you anyway, a child too young, a face too familiar, a smell that reminded you of your own home. And suddenly, the role slipped. You weren't the sin-eater. You were just a person, eating in the dark. That's when the weight felt real, not the sins. The silence. The term sin-eater might be British, but the idea wasn't exclusive. Across the world, people found ways to feed the dead, to cleanse them, to keep them gone. In Nepal, certain castes performed rituals to absorb pollution from death. In parts of West Africa, food was left out not as an offering, but as bait, to draw away the remnants of a troubled soul. In early Russia, mourners drank vodka and ate black bread beside the corpse. Some said the bitterness drew out regret. In China, spirit tablets were burned with meals, not for honor, for balance, for peace. It didn't matter what religion ruled. People didn't trust death to take care of itself, so they found ways to help it along. Food was easy, familiar, symbolic. You chew and something passes. And even when it wasn't called sin-eating, it felt close, because in every case, someone stood between the living and the gone. Someone swallowed the fear. It didn't stop all at once. There was no official ban, no grand final ritual, just fewer calls, fewer coins, fewer families willing to admit they ever believed in it. The world was changing. Priests came more often, doctors too. People started trusting science, or at least paperwork. death got cleaner, more medical, less mysterious, and when death changes, so do the people around it. The superstitions dry up, the fear shifts shape. Some sin-eaters died without replacement, others faded into other roles. Farmhands, beggars, ghosts, their names were lost, not because they weren't remembered, but because people didn't want to remember them. Even today, most people haven't heard of sin-eating, and if they do, it sounds like fiction, a folk tale, something that couldn't possibly be real, but it was, and for a while it was how people coped, by giving their worst parts to someone else. Be honest, if you lived back then, no plumbing, no doctors, no answers, would you have done it? Hired the sin-eater, laid the bread on your uncle's chest, hoping guilt could be passed like a bad coin. Or maybe you'd have taken the job. You were hungry. Your child needed shoes. The priest hadn't come in months, and here was a way to earn something, even if it was just a crust and a curse. Just kneel, just eat, just become invisible. Not everyone turned the sin-eater away. Someone always answered the door. Someone always watched the ritual, even if they claimed they didn't believe, because deep down they did. And if you were there, in that time, in that fear, maybe you would have believed too. You don't see sin-eaters anymore, not with bread, not with ale, but the idea, it stuck around. You can find it in apology dinners, in awkward hospital visits, in the way someone shows up, listens, and quietly absorbs what others can't handle. Modern sin-eaters don't crouch by coffins. They sit in therapist chairs. They answer late-night calls. They take on guilt that isn't theirs just to make someone else feel lighter. The food has changed, the words have changed, but the impulse is the same. Take this from me. Hold it, carry it away. That's all sin-eating ever was, a desperate trade, a quiet mercy, a job no one wanted, but someone always did. If you could ask one of them, just once, what it felt like, what do you think they'd say? Maybe nothing. Silence was part of the job. Or maybe they'd shrug, say it was just work, that bread's bread, and sin's sin, and someone had to do it. But if they were honest, they might tell you the hardest part wasn't the eating, it was walking away, leaving the house still full of grief, but slightly lighter, knowing you helped, but only a little, and not enough. They might say the job wasn't cursed, just lonely, that the worst things don't come from the dead, they come from being ignored by the living, and maybe they'd ask you a question in return, not, did it work, but would you have remembered me if I hadn't eaten? Somewhere, centuries ago, someone took the last bite. Maybe they didn't know it. Maybe they thought the job would pass on, like it always had, but it didn't. The world shifted. The rituals dimmed. The bread dried out one final time. No one came after. And that's how it ended, not with a scream or a sermon, but with a swallow. A quiet act, done in the corner of a quiet room, by someone no one wanted to touch. No monument, no record, just the memory of a role too useful to bless and too shameful to keep. But maybe that's what made it powerful. Because it was never about glory. It was about doing something no one else would do, and doing it anyway.